All right, so y'all that have been following me for anything longer than like, I don't know, 2 or 3 months know that depending on what day of the week it is and what type of mood I'm in, Prince is my favorite artist of all time. So much so that the minute that I graduated from high school, I started wearing paisley button downs, chunky heel Chelsea boots, and started growing my hair out. So by the time I got to college that September, it'd be long enough for hair rollers. Consequently, I also wound up losing my virginity before I learned my stop on the Market Frankfurt line. So, any of y'all who have followed this channel for any longer than, I don't know, like 2 months maybe, know that depending on which way the moon waxes and what kind of clouds are out that day, Kendrick Lamar is my favorite rapper of all time. So much, though, that it is not at all hyperbole to say that Kenny single handedly made me fall back in love with hip hop while I was neck deep into my skinhead phase. Which I mean, considering that I already did have the buzz cut and leather jacket, I just needed to trade my docs in for some black butters, and nobody would have been able to tell the difference anyway. Whatever. Point I'm getting at is, aside from probably Jimi Hendrix, there have been no two more influential musicians on my personal artistry than Prince and Kenny, and as a result, I kind of couldn't help but notice that these two are basically the same nigga down to needing a step stool to smooch their lady. Now, full disclosure, the OG version of this script was written like 2 years ago, so there's probably a bunch of points in that one that I've forgotten since. But I also, there's probably some here that I don't think I would have thought about back then. Whatever, all things work together, right? I've been calling Kendrick Lamar Prince for niggas who grew up on Pop Tarts and Pokemon cards for a minute now. But the further we get away from Kenny's TDE era, the more that sentiment does ring true for me. And I'm kind of halfway surprised that more people don't talk about that parallel. But then I also think about the fact that we probably don't, because for as many similarities as there are between the two, there are a couple of ginormous parts of Prince's career and character that's a lot less Kendrick Lamar and a lot more Aubrey Graham. Yeah, go ahead and get your pitchforks out, folks. I'm ready for it. So join me in this exercise in overthinking as I explain to you why Prince was both the first Kendrick and the first Drake at the same time. And perhaps more importantly, why there will never be another artist like any of those three once Drizzy and Kenny finally decide to call it a career. In Drake's case, probably a lot sooner than later, which honestly is still much later than it should have been. Okay, so I'm gonna spare y'all the whole behind the music blurb on any of these artists because it's irrelevant to the points that I want to make. Rather, I want to focus on the philosophy behind each artist's respective artistry and how it impacted their trajectories. So Kenny, like Prince, knew pretty early on that he was going to pursue music as a career. And like Prince, wasted no time getting started, releasing his first mixtape around 15 or 16 or so. Again, all of that isn't that relevant because who didn't write raps or start a band in high school? The OV hoes, that's who, and that's why nobody likes y'all. Kenny has this skill for articulating these big sociological concepts, or big according to, you know, the smart guys in the room, and not only breaking them down to the point that anyone but an OV hoe can understand, but making them tangible for people for whom those concepts aren't really real otherwise. So again, the big smart guys in the room. The most obvious example I could think of is literally the entire third verse of Not Like Us, which is basically just a breakdown on the gentrification of Atlanta as well as cultural appropriation. But then there's also tracks like Institutionalized off TPAB, which I mean should be pretty obvious just based on the title track alone, and pretty much the entire track list for GKMC. I think the most common misconception about Kendrick is of he being a conscious rapper in the general sense that we use that term. What I mean is niggas act like Kendrick is Hobson or Corday just because his raps have substance beyond the beat. And like I said in the diss track video, every rapper until probably Kanye and Drake displayed some level of consciousness in their music, even if it was just a quick life's a bit, then you die before going back to the money cash hoes. But I'm not going to dwell on that since I already talked about that in that video. Again, go check that out. But my point is, it's clear that whether because of an ego twice as big as his shoe size or a genuine desire to change the world, for much of Kendrick's life and career, he saw music as a vehicle through which to pursue an even higher calling. Which brings me back to the purple one. The earliest known video of Prince that we have was an interview conducted by a Minneapolis news station when he was 11, asking him about a teacher strike that was occurring at the time, in which Prince, his best as a preteen could, basically caped for living wages. It was always weird to me how shocked some people were when they saw Prince co-sign Black Lives Matters or played that concert for Freddie Gray. Like, have y'all not listened to anything he made besides Purple Rain? Well, I mean, since he didn't let any of his work be streamed during his lifetime, you likely didn't. But so-called leftist or progressive themes are all over Prince's discography. Like the title track for 1999 is literally about a nuclear holocaust. The nigga basically made a diss track against Ronald Reagan, for which that alone makes him a real nigga Hall of Famer. I guess because Prince never made his politics his brand like, I don't know, Bono or Madonna, it kind of got lost in all of the blowjob and box eating metaphors. But that's kind of where I'm headed, right? You can't really pin Prince or Kenny down as conscious or leftist or progressive because they're more complicated and honestly much too contradictory for that, like again most people are. Like Prince kind of developed this reputation later in life as a homophobe, which I mean at first glance is like the ultimate irony, but when you consider it is, Prince is actually pretty on brand. And to be fair, he did wind up walking back those comments, but still, the rabbit was out of the hat already. Kendrick, on the other hand, is a born-again Christian, possibly Hebrew Israelite adjacent Eckhart Tolle disciple who spent the whole summer clowning Drake for being a PDF file and a human trafficker, but also popped out on stage like 3 weeks later with known women's rights activist Dr. Dre before firing a few rounds at Andrew Scholes like 4 months later because, I mean, you know, protect black women and all that. Which, again, if you do know any hoteps in real life, that's like so totally on brand that it's cliche, to be honest. But again, y'all don't go outside. Not like us. You see, I told y'all these niggas were basically the same, right? But really my point in all of this is that both Kendrick and Prince use music as the primary vehicle to communicate their personal philosophy, not the other way around like a lot of their contemporaries. And as a result, they became the primary voice of the culture during their respective generations. Well, one of them in Prince's case, which brings me to Mike. I feel like Michael Jackson's legacy has kind of been unfairly diminished by the millennial and Gen Z music snobs who didn't discover Prince until after he died and decided to crown him king by virtue of recency bias. Like, admittedly, I've been guilty of making this comparison myself, but Drake is nowhere near a comp for Michael, except in the most shallowest of senses, i.e. their similar pop chart success and they possessing a comparable peer in their lifetime that they seemingly went head to head to. I'll get back to that later on. And I mean, I get it. You can't help but draw a parallel between Mike and Prince's rivalry and that of Drake and Kendrick, especially considering the narrative around each of those. The most misplaced misconception about Mike, however, is that he wasn't a musician, which is wild considering that the man literally grew up around and in the music industry. It's just that Mike's legacy is just as, if not more so, as an entertainer as it is of a musician, not unlike Beyonce, which honestly is the closest modern comp we have to him. And even that still kind of undersells his impact. Everybody always talks about Drake's chart success as a comparison, which one we will get to, and two is inflated. But Mike had the first tour in history to gross over $100 million and the second highest grossing tour of the 80s, right behind Pink Floyd. the sixth highest of that same decade as part of the Jackson 5, and the fifth highest in the 90s, well after his peak. And again, you got to understand, this is back when concert tickets weren't the price of a used car. The adjusted gross of artists' tours just gets gaudier the closer to today you get. Drake's biggest tour of the 2010s comes nowhere near the top 10 of that decade, and he barely squeezes into the 2020s, and we still got a whole half decade left for him to get knocked back out. Like I said in the past, Drake is unequivocally the biggest rapper of the last 10 or 12 years or so, and one of the biggest pop stars. But he's not Mike, not even close. And that's not just my anti-OV whole bias speaking either. It could not be overstated how the internet has fundamentally changed the way we consume and understand music as a commodity. All those records that Mike broke, he did that without streaming, without Apple Music, without an army of glizzy gulpers on payroll singing the praises of his painfully mid music. Just good old-fashioned radio play and record sales, and like physical records, as in you got to get up, put some clothes on, and walk down to the local record store and buy the album. Not a single, but the whole album, dog. Yeah, we cared that much back then. I know it's kind of hard for the mind to grasp that concept, but whatever. Moving on. The old man take. And let's make it plain. Because the common narrative is while Mike was the hit maker, Prince was the artiste, the musician par excellence of the 80s, which, yeah, he was. But anyone who knows Mike knows that he was not only a musician in his own right, but that he was just as dedicated to the craft as Prince was, to the point that he became a notorious workaholic, to the point that he kind of low-key worked himself to death, if we're going to be real. The closest thing to Mike in our time, again, is probably a combination of Beyonce's artistry and Taylor Swift's popularity. Like, the only reason we make the comparison between he and Drake is because we overestimate Drake's impact based on his chart success. And to be honest, the fact that most of y'all niggas don't listen to nothing else besides hip-hop to begin with. Drake is a rapper who became so popular that he became pop, but he was nowhere near the king of pop at any point in his career. During the first half of his peak, that was Bruno Mars. And in the second half, it was either The Weeknd or Ed Sheeran, depending on what year we're talking about. And today it's probably Harry Styles. I really don't know what y'all be listening to. Shabuzi, maybe? Whatever. Post Malone. I hate him. My point is, as popular as Drake and Kendrick are, neither is as big as a lot of us assume them to be. We just don't listen to any of them other niggas, so we're not really aware of their significance. Like, I'm not going to lie, I didn't even realize that Post Malone was still a thing until Billboard said that he had the song of the summer, and I still don't know who Morgan Wallen is, and I don't care. Sorry, bro, country just ain't my bag, dog. It might slap, it probably doesn't, but give me some good old Johnny Cash, man, if we're going to do country. But let's get down to why we really love to do these comps. The beefs. And this is where I'm going to go left on y'all just a little bit. So there's a few stories out there, like how Prince once purposefully hit a ping pong ball at Mike's pecker as the two were becoming cordial when Prince tried talking to LaToya. But what we do know is that during a James Brown performance in '83, Mike got to perform with the King of Soul and allegedly told James to call Prince up to follow him. And of course, Prince, being the embodiment of small man syndrome, tried and honestly failed to do his best Jimi Hendrix impression and wound up falling into a lamppost and into the crowd, making a fool of himself in the process. And those were Mike's words, not mine. Allegedly, at least. Remember, Mike was already the biggest pop star in the world at this point, and Prince was so small compared to him that James evidently didn't even know who he was when Mike dared Prince to follow him, albeit that might have been because of, the kilos of coke in James's system, but y'all get my point, right? Now, who's to say if this was an honest goodwill gesture from one artist trying to put the other on with the elders, or if Mike was just trying to prove that Prince couldn't see his cojones at that point in their shared history. But the point is, Prince got little broed in the worst way possible, twice on the same night, by a nigga whose voice sounds like a perpetual lullaby.
That is so stupid. That's the most ridiculous, horrifying story I've ever heard. It's crazy.
And from that point, Prince and Mike's relationship was at best frosty, even if said frost was primarily one-sided. And this is kind of where Prince starts to look a lot more like Drake than he does Kenny. And Mike looks like Mike, I guess, which honestly, what Mike looks like changes depending on what era we're talking about. Apparently, Prince was supposed to feature on Bad, but turned it down after he had a falling out over who got to say the line, "Your butt is mine," which, depending on who you believe, Mike would have taken that line out, and Prince knew this. He just wanted an excuse to say no. Additionally, Prince wound up turning down a spot on the We Are the World track when he found out that Mike was listed as a co-writer on it.
But if you just believe.
There's also this story about Mike attending a show with will.i.am back when will.i.am mattered, and Prince hopped off the stage and introduced himself to Will while playing the most aggressive bass solo within kissing distance of Mike's face. Also, there's a story that Purple Rain came about because Prince wanted to one-up the Thriller video, which, I mean, you take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have probably the greatest movie soundtrack of all time, but also the absolute worst movie of the 80s, probably. I don't know. I wasn't born until 91. Ask my sister. All the cattiness aside, though, all signs seem to indicate that Mike and Prince, at the very least, had a mutual respect for each other's artistry and talent, with Tavis Smiley, a close friend of Prince, claiming that the Purple One stayed locked in his room for several days after Mike's passing. And that's kind of where the parallel between the Drake and Kendrick beef goes sideways, because if we didn't know it before, there's no doubt that Kendrick not only didn't respect Drake, he couldn't even stand the idea of him, much less consider him a peer or even a man for that matter. That's the thing about Prince and Mike. Despite the way we remember it, Prince and Mike occupied two almost completely different lanes. I'm not even sure they had a rivalry in the sense of directly competing with each other, so much as it was Prince proving himself worthy of being considered Mike's peer commercially. But so was Madonna, so was Billy Joel, so was every big solo pop act of the 80s. Every artist of that decade was looking up at Michael Jackson. It's just that every artist not named Prince was looking up at Prince also, which is kind of hard to do considering, the short man jokes, y'all. I got a million of them. I ain't that creative. My point is, it's indisputable that Mike was the biggest artist of the 80s, period. Prince may have taken the crown during the off seasons, but the minute that Mike dropped, the whole world stopped to bow and kiss the ring. What I'm saying is, in a lot of ways, Kenny is the Mike of his few, in that, again, despite what the charts and what DJ Glazademics have to say, Drake spent most of the 2010s chasing Kendrick, not the other way around. I and a bunch of other people who know better, including FD, have already said this ad nauseum, so I won't dwell, but the charts were never enough for Drake's validation. More than any record or any accolade, Drake wanted the respect of his peers and elders. More than anything, he wanted the gatekeepers to pass him the baton, and they never did. And I mean, there is a more than fair argument that he did have a legit gripe back then, but considering what we know now, kudos to the gatekeepers, like round of applause. That being said, one of, if not the main reasons the torch was never passed to Drake was because he wanted the culture's validation, but not the community that came with it. Because embracing community meant embracing the struggle that informs it, and Drake never wanted that part of it. Case in point, the Alton Sterling letter. For y'all that don't know or don't remember, Alton Sterling was a local hustle man in Baton Rouge who was shot and killed by police there in 2016 after one of the officers said, quote, "I will shoot you in the effing head," if he did not comply. And no, he didn't say effing, but my kids are in the other room, man. Give me a break. Now, according to people on the scene, an incident was reported prior to the altercation, but Sterling didn't do anything to warrant the response he was given. Matter of fact, the owner of the store where Sterling hustled his bootleg tape said that Sterling wasn't even the problem in the altercation for which the police were called. Now, you got to understand where we are in the timeline here. BLM was basically an institution by this point, thanks in no small part to the deaths of Freddie Gray and Michael Brown in like the 18 or so months prior. And pretty much every black celebrity who mattered, and even a lot of non-black ones, had already thrown their unequivocal support behind BLM, except for Drake. Now, I already know what the OV hoes are going to say about Drake not being the only rapper to decline a public endorsement of BLM. I'm looking directly at you, Tyler. But he was the biggest, and that's kind of the problem. Remember, this is a guy who built his brand on being unfairly denied a cookout invite, despite he and his stans feeling like he should man the grill at that. Fair or not, that's the cost of the torch. It's not enough to be a chart topper. It's not even enough to be artist par excellence. You're expected to be the spokesman of the culture. And how can you do that when the only time you show up is for the cookout? Add to that the fact that TPAB had dropped like a little over a year earlier and basically said everything the culture had been feeling since Ferguson. Drake's claim to the crown was slipping by the day, and I think he knew that, which is why he wrote the letter. It's kind of wild to me how so much has happened since then that people just kind of forgot that the day after Sterling's murder, Drake published an open letter on the incident that honestly feels a lot more like a PR statement than something genuinely from the heart. Like, y'all know that meme where you got the Klan on one side and a bunch of black people on the other, and then there's that one nigga in the middle telling them to compromise? That's basically what Drake did in a nutshell, and it's why I cringe so hard whenever he does get compared to Mike. I mean, despite looking more and more like a white woman in his later years, Mike never moved or viewed himself as anything other than a black man. If you need any proof of that, I mean, remember the time is right there. On top of Mike being the whitest thing in that video, it's basically a Hotep's wet dream with a who's who of black all-stars as the cast. They Don't Care About Us and Black or White are also right freaking there. Liberian Girl is basically an unofficial anthem for women from that country. Now, I will give credit where it's due to Drake for showing love to the dark-skinned girls in his early years, but again, in hindsight, how much of that was genuine and how much was he exploiting black women's insecurities to build a brand? Meanwhile, half the reason Thriller was made was because Mike made up his mind to sweep the Grammys after he'd been told that a black artist would never get the cover for Rolling Stone. He's literally the reason why MTV started putting black artists in their rotation, including Prince. My point is, from womb to tomb, Mike was always of the culture, and that's why the culture went so hard for him, even through his many scandals and let's call them eccentricity. Let's call it that. I don't know. I don't know why you would hang a baby over a balcony. Whatever, man. Moving on. Let the man rest. Again, Drake never bothered building that kind of currency with the culture because he was too busy making himself as inoffensive as possible to keep the pop girlies and Eminem stans on his side. But while I am on Thriller, that might be the one place where the Mike comparisons do make the most sense between the two, but perhaps not in the way some of y'all may think. If there is a quintessential 80s album, it's Thriller. Like, it sounds like that decade, the early 80s at that. And that was by design. Mike wanted to grab from every sound that was popping at the moment and make an album of nothing but straight bangers, even if said bangers came at the cost of originality. Now, who does that sound like to you? And that is the fatal flaw in Mike's artistry. Mike's music is timeless because Mike is timeless. But in a vacuum, like I said, sounds like when it was made. I mean, you could practically guess what year an MJ track was made by just listening to the first couple of chords. That isn't to say that it's a bad thing. It's just to say that Mike's music a lot of times feels like a time capsule, which is at best the fate for Drake. Now, on the other end, the first Prince song I remember hearing and knowing it was Prince was Adore. And because this was like the late 90s, early 2000s or so, I just assumed this was another old head trying to ride the neo soul motion that was moving during the time. Until I found out that the joint was written in 1987. Prince was both ahead and of his time in a way that Mike never was, which is what made him the greatest musician in my opinion, but more importantly, made him timeless. Prince wasn't afraid to adopt and adapt new sounds to his own, but he also wasn't so quick to just hop onto the hottest thing smoking just for the sake of a hit. Prince at his core is a funk artist. That foundation is on even his most experimental projects. It's wild because Prince's gender bending public persona was exactly what his music was after his first 3 or so albums. There was never a point where you could say, oh yeah, Prince is this, because he was all of it at the same time, calling back to his own influences as much as he was pushing the envelope. And in the process created a sound that was both uniquely timeless and uniquely him, equal parts familiar and foreign. Now, who does that sound like? If you want an example, look no further than Kenny's latest project. What I'm still not completely convinced isn't a mixtape, but Kendrick wears his inspirations on his sleeve in this project without feeling derivative. Like, Reincarnated might as well be an unreleased pop track, and God knows we got more than enough of those. And Man in the Garden is basically One Mic Part 2. Listening to TPAB feels like a crash course in black music history, and again, that wasn't by accident. I told this story before about how I discovered some of my favorite artists through my favorite artists. Specifically, I discovered Son House through the White Stripes, specifically their cover of Death Letter Blues. Part of the reason I say TPAB is probably the most important album of the 2010s is because of the way it interprets black music history through a 21st century lens. Oh, you've never heard a James Brown record? First of all, how? Secondly, King Kunta is right there. How about the Isleys? Listen to I. Parliament Funkadelic, they're literally sampled on Blacker the Berry. It's more than just the sampling though, it's the cadence, it's the voice changes, sometimes even just reusing and repurposing lyrics from the songs that inspired him. These are all markers of somebody who has thought long and hard about what he's doing, someone who honors his craft like a religion. But I mean, that really could be said about a bunch of people not named Prince or Kendrick, Mike being one of them and Drake being not. The point I'm getting at is Mike wasn't just a hit maker. Matter of fact, his ultimate legacy might not even be as a musician, but as an entertainer. Like I said, he was what Beyonce is now, but even more popular somehow. And it's a shame because the musicianship of both artists kind of gets overshadowed by that aspect of their artistry. I feel like it's a very hipster-ish attitude to place Prince on his pedestal because he played instruments and Mike didn't. And again, I'm saying this as a nigga who wore boots with heels because of the man. In the same vein, I feel like it's equally as cringe to place Kendrick in a place beyond critique because his artistry is so substantive. Matter of fact, that's exactly why OG fans like myself hold him to such lofty standards in the first place. And I can't help but acknowledge when he doesn't meet the goals that I've set for him, even though I know he genuinely doesn't give a damn. Whatever, that's part of the magic, isn't it? Like, there's nothing wrong with a good Car Test album from K-Dot. Matter of fact, that's one aspect of his game I still think he doesn't get enough credit for. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like every project he drops is a freaking Mona Lisa. And that is where I personally see the most similarities with Prince. Prince's ugly divorce from Warner Brothers has already been pretty well documented, so I won't dwell. But the point in me bringing that up is once the clock struck 1996 and Prince was freed from his contract, he just started doing whatever he wanted. And for the long time Prince stands in the audience, it was kind of off-putting. just like Mr. Morale was for a lot of people when it dropped. Not me though. I told y'all that John was going to age like Angela Bassett, didn't I? By this point in his career arc, Prince had already proven everything he has set out to. Matter of fact, by the latter days of his Warner Brothers contract, Prince had, if not surpassed, at least matched Mike in relevance. I mean, Diamonds and Pearls, dangerous. The Gold Experience, history. Y'all see what I'm saying, right? Musicology, invincible. Matter of fact, by this point in their rivalry, Mike and Prince were transitioning into elder status anyway. The decade, for the most part, belonged to grunge and boy bands. In a similar fashion, just within the rap sphere, this era belongs to the girlies, period. Like, let's be real. And Kendrick, I think, not only knows, but accepts this. It was clear from jump that Kendrick felt like he had something to prove with GKMC. He was staking his claim as the voice for the culture during that decade. And in a lot of ways, he pretty much succeeded, just like Prince did. See, despite his perpetual 1B status, Prince managed to communicate the pulse of the people in a way that I don't think Mike ever did. Controversy and Dirty Mind paved the way for the raunchy hedonism that would become standard practice by the end of that decade. And again, remember who's listening to these tracks. All of those young boomers who had just seen the church betray them during the rights revolution of the 60s. And they weren't really trying to hear anything that their parents were trying to tell them about shallow morality anymore. The Cold War turning hot was the biggest anxiety most average Americans had when 1999 dropped, and still had like 7 or 8 years later when America did. Pop life is as much about Prince's exasperation with his own celebrity as it is a commentary on the blind excess of that decade. The best and most obvious parallel is between Sign of the Times and TPAB, I think. I think the thing that people misunderstand about TPAB is that it's not really a protest album in that sense. If you think so, you weren't really listening to it. Yeah, it's definitely political. Pretty much everything Kendrick makes is political to some degree since Overly Dedicated. TPAP, however, doesn't really offer any solutions for the state of things in Black America at the time, the same way that a conscious rap album would. It just says what it is and challenges you to come up with your own solutions. In a similar way, Sign of the Times doesn't really give you any answers for how to fix society's problems. Hanif Abdurraqib puts it best when he says that Prince lays out the landscape of the culture, presents all of the options available, and then dares you to pick one and live with it. There is no right or wrong answer, according to Kenny or Prince. There's just what it is and everything you can do to survive through it. There is no right or wrong reaction except not reacting at all. These two albums serve as kind of the capstones to that arc in their respective careers, I think. In my opinion, Sign of the Times is Prince's magnum opus, as is TPAB is Kendrick's. And I feel like they knew it when they made it. There was nothing else left to do for either besides look inward. FD mentioned this in his Drake video, and yes, I do reference FD a lot in these type of discussions, especially about hip hop, because I don't believe in taking white opinions on such. I'm sorry, Fantano and Professor Sky, y'all are cool, y'all are down, but y'all can't come to the cookout. You can get a plate though, but bring your own aluminum. All right, that's the deal. Anyway, Damn to me sounds like Kendrick's realization that TPAB didn't have the impact that he probably expected. In a lot of ways, it was just like the Summer of Floyd, in that the immediate response, as big and loud as it was, wound up being little more than symbolic of doing a whole bunch of everything and nothing at the same time, ultimately. In Damn, Kendrick is kind of coping with that fact that he's not as important as he was led to believe. He's not the savior that the media crowned him as when GKMC came out. At EOD, he's just a mortal man that makes good music. So instead of wasting energy trying to fix the culture, he's going to use that energy to fix himself. And maybe the culture will follow his lead. Maybe. That's what Mr. Morale is. Like I said earlier, during their peaks, there was never a time where Prince had clearly cleared Mike. It was always at best he was considered an equal, but that wasn't good enough. And maybe he just kind of conceded that by the end of the 80s, and that's where Drake comes back in now. Again, despite he being the undisputed hit maker of the big three, Drake never got the same kind of respect that Kenny or even Cole got from the culture. Like I said, Drake, Kenny, and even Cole and Tyler all occupied different lanes, but that wasn't enough for Drake. He needed the charts and the think pieces. He needed the elders to see his artistry as at worst on par with Kenny's, and we never did, and we are never going to at this point. So he just gave up on that. Drake went full pop star, using hip hop as his vehicle. In a similar manner, Prince in the early 90s was less concerned with competing with Mike as he was getting out of that record deal, which is why he just started churning out albums like an assembly line. Once he just started experimenting, throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what worked. But that was because he wanted to do that. Even though the frequencies of their drops are like night and day, Kendrick in his post TDE era knows that the public is going to gas whatever he does so long as it's quality, even if it's not made with us entirely in mind. That's what GNX is to me. It's a celebration of all of Kendrick's greatest inspirations, his home coast specifically. Drake did something similar, but to an almost completely different effect and for a different motive. In the back of Drake's mind, I think it still bothers him how little we respect his artistry. But the catch is that Drake's artistry is his mass appeal, not unlike Mike's. Remember what I said about Drake and Mike just grabbing whatever was popping at the time and making that their sound? That was the unforeseen consequence of Thriller. By purposely making an album for the charts, Mike kind of handicapped himself into doing that to stay relevant for the rest of his career. Again, Thriller sounds like 1983, as does Bad sounds like 87, Dangerous like 1990 or 90, whenever it came out, and so on. And after a while, that formula gets kind of stale, which is why Mike's post-history period isn't remembered nearly as fondly as what came before. I'm not going to sit here and act like Invincible ain't have some bangers on it, but it was a fall off if there ever was one. And honestly, it probably started with History, despite it topping out at number one. Mike in the 2000s was just playing the hits at that point, while Prince was still evolving into middle age. And it never really hurt him in the way that it did Mike, because that's what we come to expect from the purple one. In a similar manner, Drake post Scorpions feels in a lot of ways like a nigga just throwing darts at the wall because his voice is going stale and he doesn't know how to grow past it. So he just doubles down and becomes the worst possible version of himself. Mike and Kenny are similar in that they knew pretty early that they couldn't be touched. They were in a race against themselves while everybody else was just trying to make the podium. Drake and Prince were always looking over their shoulder or up at who they considered to be their chief rival during their peaks. The difference is Mike did eventually wind up looking up at Prince to some degree, but it only came after Prince didn't care anymore. At least his approach to music made it appear as though he didn't. Behind the scenes, Prince was a petty bastard until death. Let's just keep it a buck. Like Kenny alluded during the great rap beef of 2024, Drake is not even in his lane, and it pisses him off that he even thinks that he is. The contempt that Kenny had for Drake was never about competition the way it was for Prince and Mike. It was about artistry and even philosophy. Kendrick hates the very idea of what Drake is, let alone that idea being anywhere near what Kendrick is as an artist. And call it fair or out of bounds, but that's how Kenny sees it, and why no matter what the charts or even the culture would have said, Kenny was never going to compete with Drake, let alone chase him in the first place. He was always going to do exactly what he wound up doing, and that's publicly execute Drake's image and legacy as soon as he got the opportunity. I don't think that Prince or Mike ever would have done that to one another. That was Drizzy's biggest mistake, if you ask me, assuming that Kendrick respected him the same way that he respected Kendrick. Like, let's not get that twisted. Despite what revisionist history may wind up saying further down the line, Drake always viewed Kendrick as a peer, which is why he chased after him to begin with. Matter of fact, I'd argue that Drake considered Kendrick his only true peer, the way that Prince considered Mike. The problem, like I said, was that unlike Prince and Mike, the feeling was not really mutual. Even if Prince and Mike occupied different lanes, and even if their philosophy on artistry differed, they recognized and respected what the other had and was trying to accomplish for the culture. While yes, Prince may have wanted Mike's spot, he didn't want to be Mike. Drake wanted to be Kendrick until he realized the culture was never going to let him be that. And I'm not talking about Kendrick specifically. I'm talking about whoever the gatekeepers crowned as the voice of the culture. That was always going to be Drake's primary rival in his head until it was him who was in that spot. Or again, that's at least what he convinced himself of. In a lot of ways, the parallels between all of Drake, Kenny, Prince, and Mike represent the way black music has evolved over the past 4 decades or so. Prince and Mike are two sides of the same coin. Collectively, they represent the pinnacle of black music's history. That this was the first time that I can think of where black people dominated American music, both artistically and commercially, from the front. Whether you want to say Prince was the artist and Mike was the hit maker is really irrelevant to the impact that they collectively had on and for the culture. Prince proved that black music could be challenging, could be cutting edge, and be commercially viable all at the same time to the point of topping the charts. While Mike just hammered home the fact that we did and always have run this ish. The difference was we were being recognized for it this time. And they recognized that in each other. Drake's problem is that he got greedy. Even if he was never going to be Mike, he could have at least become something similar on a smaller scale, albeit, in the same way that Kenny became something similar to Prince. But Drake wanted it all, and he did because he wasn't of the culture. Had he been of the culture, he would have recognized his place within it and played yin to Kenny's yang, while the two pushed each other to higher heights for the good of the culture and not just they individually. That's kind of where I'm getting at. Drake could never be Mike, even if he did have the numbers to back it up, because everything Drake has accomplished has been for Drake and no one else. What Mike means to music, black music specifically, is more than just the numbers. Like I said, Mike was always of the culture to his dying breath, and therefore understood his role within it and played that role until he passed. Mike must have known that he was never going to get the same music snob rim jobbing that Prince has and continues to get, but there was never a point where he chased that because that was not his identity. Likewise, Prince not only played his role, but passed the torch when his time drew to a close. Drake was never going to do that, though, because like some of y'all have already said, he's neither Mike nor Prince. He's Elvis. And it's clear to me that we've officially entered his Vegas residency arc. A lot of this comes down to Drake's lacking of personhood. He is whatever will achieve that goal that he set for himself in that time. And those goals are almost always purely self-motivated. Drake couldn't care less about what he means to the culture, much less how his artistry could have elevated it. He just wanted to grift the culture for validation, and Kenny knew it and hated him for it. And part of me says that Mike and Prince probably would have also. So what was the point of this video besides the fact that my last John didn't quite perform the way that I thought it would, and Christmas is right around the corner, and I really don't want my kids to hate me this year? Well, to tell you the truth, it wasn't really to convince y'all that Prince is Kenny or Mike is Drake or vice versa or whatever. Really, it was to say that we're probably never going to get anything like this again. And to be honest, we really didn't get that with Kenny and Drake either. For one simple reason: The internet. Okay, so as boring an answer as that is, this is the main reason we'll never get another Mike v. Prince, even though really there never really was one until it didn't matter anymore anyway. Like I said before, it was Mike and then everybody else was basically playing for second. The irony of the internet is that with all of this unfettered access to information, we can choose to be willfully ignorant of things and people we wouldn't have been able to just 20 years ago. Like I said, I have no clue who Morgan Wallen is, and I still haven't heard anything by Sabrina Carpenter, and I wouldn't even know who she was if it weren't for all the young bulls gooning over her on my timeline. Like, seriously, you could find like three of her at your local Target. Whatever, man. Moving on. That wasn't the case with Mike, though. You gotta remember, Michael Jackson pioneered the art of the music video as long form storytelling. Anytime an MJ video dropped, the world stopped. And I do mean the world. If you were a kid living in some Ugandan village in 1983 and you wanted to watch Western television, you were only going to get like one and a half channels, if that. And one of them was probably playing the Thriller video. Same thing with radio. Mike had so much success with that record that if you were in some Soviet satellite state, if you didn't hear any other Western music on your radio, you were going to hear at least a few tracks off of Thriller because it was such a proven moneymaker by that point. SoundCloud, Bandcamp, insert social media sharing platform here makes it so the kind of homogeneity needed to make another Michael Jackson just doesn't exist anymore. As such, there will never be another Prince because really everybody is Prince now, honestly. The reason why Prince was and is considered the consummate musician is because his artistry defied categorization while still being commercially viable. In one album, hell, just on one track, he could and would go from funk to gospel to electronica and then melt your face off with the hardest guitar solo you ever heard. And then the next track would be like Sometimes It Snows in April or something like that. In the 40 years since, genres have effectively become meaningless now to the point that choosing a lane and just sticking with that is honestly more unique than throwing a bunch of different sounds in a blender and then putting an 808 over it. But more important than that is that the industry today just isn't conducive to nurturing a talent like Prince. Like I said in the diss track video, major labels today want a ready-made star, whether or not they flame out by the time their first album drops. What I'm saying is talent development is basically non-existent. Between his first four albums, Prince's highest charting one was Controversy, which topped out at number 22 on the Billboard 200. Prince's highest charting single during that period topped out at 11, and the only other two that made it were number 92 and 70. It wasn't until 1984 that he got his first number one album and single with Purple Rain and When Doves Cry, respectively. Now imagine UMG waiting all the way until Views to get a number one out of Drake. There wouldn't be one, is what I'm saying. And that's the sound of what could have been. My point is the industry was a bit back then, but at least it was a patient one. I often wonder to myself about the many shoulda, woulda, coulda beens that got cut loose too soon to figure it all out, or the many fly-by-night sensations that got thrust into the spotlight way before the bread got done baking. Point is, nobody wants to take a risk finding the next Prince when there's already a formula out there that works. There's never going to be another musician with that combination of vision, virtuosity, and notoriety because the industry doesn't want that anymore. And I'm sorry, as much as I love Kendrick, he's not that. But he might be the closest thing that we got. And pretty soon, we probably ain't going to have him either. Despite his practical ubiquity in pop culture these days, I genuinely don't foresee a future 20 or 30 years down the road where kids are going to universally cite Drake as a primary influence on their artistry to the point that is practically a prerequisite for such. And to be honest, I don't really believe that is going to be the case for Kendrick either, just based on the fact that kids today have access to so many other artists to inspire them. Many we might not ever even know exist until the next great pop star mentions them during their Grammy acceptance speech. That's kind of the thing I want y'all to take away from all of this, that practically every musician that you've heard of and haven't cites, if not both, then at least one of Prince and Mike is having some influence on their artistry. Two black men going in for the culture. And in return, the culture gave them immortality. Equally, I think we should all kind of take a second and really appreciate Kenny and even Drake for what they are, because again, there's a good chance we might not ever get them again. Even now, hip hop is kind of reverting back to its regional roots, largely again because we don't have to listen to Kenny or Drizzy if we don't want to. My favorite rapper right now is Big X the Plug, who I literally found by accident. Didn't even realize he was a meme when I heard him for the first time. But I promise you, I would have never heard him on Power 99. This may just be the pessimist in me talking, but again, it's hard to imagine 20 or 30 years from now the great pop stars of that day citing Drake or Kendrick as ubiquitously as we do Mike and Prince. Again, maybe Beyonce will get there at some point, but I doubt it for her also, for all the reasons I said, that Mike is arguably the most famous face of the 20th century. And perhaps there's a case to be made that no one should ever be that famous again, and I tend to agree, but it behooves us to at least acknowledge what we're losing in the process. A common cultural thread, and not just for black people, but people, period. Prince's cultural footprint goes far beyond music, to the point that you don't have to have ever heard a Prince song and still know who he is. He's been everywhere and in everything, from Animaniacs to Scary Movie, the Super Bowl. Okay, so personally, I thought the whole Wayne should have got it thing was silly from jump, to keep it a buck. Because I mean, have you seen this man perform lately? The nigga has spent like the last decade burning his synapses to a crisp. He's in no shape to perform, let alone headline a show that big. And even if you were, I'm sorry, but remember, the whole point of the Super Bowl halftime show since the 90s has been to draw as many non-football watching eyes to the product and thereby the ads as possible. And Wayne, even during his peak, was never a big enough draw in any single year that there weren't better options out there. And neither would Kenny be if it weren't for the beef. That's why I thought that the discourse was dumb from jump. Kendrick got the halftime show not because he's the greatest rapper on the planet, but because he is the most buzzworthy artist of the last year. The whole world was talking about this beef to the point that it made headlines on cable news. Mike didn't need that, and neither did Prince. Matter of fact, Mike is the reason the Super Bowl show has become such a big freaking deal in the first place. He made it must-see TV back when it was still largely an afterthought to the game itself. And that's been the bar ever since. Someone who's in the moment notoriety is big enough to convince your sports averse friends and family to watch 2 hours of grossly overpriced and uncreative television ads and 1 hour of human car crashes. What I'm saying is, believe it or not, there's a significant chunk of people who are going to watch this year's show who have never heard a Kendrick song. And believe it or not, some who never even heard of him before the beef, and quite possibly still haven't. Even still, you got some people out there bitching about how they're tired of seeing rappers headline the show, despite Snoop and Dre being the only other hip hop themed act to headline since the Black Eyed Peas in 2011. Like, Jesus Christ, I'll be so glad when y'all learn to develop a personality that isn't just racism. You didn't have to worry about any of that with Michael Jackson. And the only people complaining about Prince when he headlined his show were the young bulls who haven't heard him yet, because again, the whole streaming thing. In fact, the latter didn't get his show until the late 2000s, when his relevance should have been at its nadir, and wound up putting on the best one since probably Mike, coincidentally enough. The only rapper who had enough notoriety, in my opinion, to warrant a halftime show off the back of their star power alone was probably Kanye. But yeah, we can hang that up at this point. But that all leads me now to the real ending of this video. Then I say in the last joint that I'm a pew baby. After all, y'all should expect at least 3 separate closings when I do these. I said in the diss track video that I believe Drake v. Kendrick was the culture's last stand against complete commodification, and I still feel that way. I just didn't stop to consider the cost until recently. Y'all that follow my community posts know that there's a game that I won't name because I do want y'all to go play it if you haven't, that I've been dedicating almost all my free time to for like the past month or so. Actually, I will. It's Cyberpunk 2077. Please go play the joint now. Matter of fact, I'm about to drop some pretty heavy spoilers here. So if you haven't played it and you plan on it, which again you should, jump to the timestamp in 3, 2, 1. Is y'all gone? They gone, Clarence? Oh well, too late. So in the final mission, you finally find a solution to the problem that you've been trying to fix for like 3/4 of the game's runtime. The catch is that that problem has already done so much damage that you might be better off just letting it take over at this point and trying your luck off in a new frontier. That's basically the state of the culture. And I mean, I know the whole hip hop is dead thing has been done to death, but it kind of is. At least the culture is, or what the culture has been historically is. Like I said a few months ago, this is why I keep saying no, y'all can't come to the cookout. Once you start letting people in, then other much less well-meaning folk take that as a sign that not only are they invited to, but they get the man to grill when they come. And then they start throwing stuff like parsnips and cauliflower on it, which are two of my favorite white foods, for the record. That's a deep cut reference that only the real ones will get. Y'all know who you are. So the only thing left to do at that point is to watch the party die, coincidentally enough. And yes, I did do that on purpose. I said before that hip hop is healing itself, and I still believe that, but it's doing so by downscaling to a level I don't really remember seeing in my lifetime. Artists of today aren't going for mass appeal so much as they are just targeting the hell out of their own particular niche and or region. There just isn't the kind of cultural solidarity, or to be honest, domination by any one region anymore to create another fulcrum for the entirety of hip hop, if that makes sense. I mean, maybe at the old cookout there is, but then if and more than likely when that person does get crowned next up, are they even hip hop anymore? Personally, I don't think so, because again that was the whole point of us leaving in the first place. And for these reasons, literally the same reasons why there won't ever be another Mike or Prince or even a Madonna or a Britney Spears for that matter, and quite possibly another Beyonce once she hangs it up, there won't ever be another Drake or Kendrick in hip hop. And it's kind of bittersweet, to keep it a buck. So I say all of that to say let's stop all of these think pieces. I know, ironic, right? And just enjoy this moment that won't ever be replicated, because the last time it came and went, we didn't even notice it. Well, I wasn't even born, so that's my excuse. Feet don't